Never underestimate the power of justice in the hands of those who truly understand it. Sometimes, it takes just one moment of courage to turn the tide against injustice. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth and spark conversations. Get your hands off me! The voice of Judge Anita Harris thundered through the courtroom, echoing against the high wooden walls. The room fell into a stunned silence as Officer Brian Cole, a man with a notorious history of aggressive behavior, froze, his hand still gripping her arm. He hadn't anticipated this reaction from the calm, composed black woman seated at the judge's bench. Anita's piercing gaze locked onto Brian's pale blue eyes, which were filled with anger and confusion. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some gasping in disbelief while others exchanged knowing looks. It wasn't every day that a police officer dared to lay hands on a judge, especially not in open court. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Brian hissed, tightening his grip. Anita, unfazed, yanked her arm free and rose to her full height, her black robe flowing like armor. "Do you have any idea who you're putting your hands on?" Her voice was sharp, commanding, yet calm, a tone that only years of fighting for justice had honed. The tension in the room reached its boiling point as Brian, flushed with rage, took a step closer. The air was electric with the unspoken question, how far is this going to go? But before anyone could predict the next move, Anita raised her voice, her tone cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Bailiff, escort Officer Cole out of my courtroom now." Gasps filled the room. A judge was throwing out a police officer, something almost unheard of. Yet, before the bailiff could move, Brian sneered. "Oh, so you think you can just throw me out? You think that robe makes you untouchable?" Anita's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer to Brian, her face mere inches from his. "That robe doesn't make me untouchable," she said, her voice steady, "but the law does. And you, Officer Cole, are breaking it." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the drama hanging heavy in the air. The tension snapped like a whip as Brian turned to leave, muttering under his breath. But before he exited, he pointed at Anita. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret this." The doors slammed shut, leaving the courtroom in a stunned silence. Everyone turned to Anita, waiting for her reaction, but she simply adjusted her robe, smoothed her hair, and sat back down. 3 days earlier, Anita had been preparing for a high-profile trial involving a young black man, Marcus Evans, who had been accused of assaulting a police officer. The evidence was flimsy at best. Body cam footage conveniently malfunctioned. Witnesses' statements conflicted, and Marcus himself claimed he'd only been trying to protect his little sister from the officer's aggressive behavior. Anita, a seasoned judge with a reputation for fairness, had been following the case closely. She wasn't just a judge. She was a woman who had clawed her way through systemic racism and sexism to reach where she was today. Raised by a single mother in Atlanta, she knew what it meant to fight for justice. She knew what it meant to face those who believed they were untouchable. Brian Cole, on the other hand, was a different story. Known for his short temper and controversial methods, he had a history of complaints lodged against him. Yet, he remained in uniform, thanks to his connections within the police department and a system that seemed more interested in protecting its own than delivering justice. As the trial began, Anita noticed Brian's presence in her courtroom. He sat in the back, his gaze locked on her. She didn't need a jury to tell her what he was doing. Intimidation was a classic tactic. But Anita was no stranger to intimidation. She'd faced it all her life, from law school professors who doubted her capabilities to colleagues who dismissed her as too emotional. Each time, she'd fought back with intelligence, grace, and an unshakable belief in the power of the law. Still, something about Brian's presence unnerved her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more than just another instance of police misconduct. There was something deeper, something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. The next day, as the trial continued, tensions in the courtroom escalated. Witnesses gave conflicting testimonies, and the prosecution seemed more interested in painting Marcus as a thug than in presenting actual evidence. Anita could feel her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. But it wasn't until Brian took the stand that things took a darker turn. Officer Cole, Anita began, her voice calm but firm. Please explain why your body cam footage was unavailable during the incident. Brian leaned back in the witness chair, his arms crossed. Technical malfunction, he said, smirking. Anita raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Is it common for body cameras to malfunction during critical moments? Look, lady. Judge, Anita corrected sharply. Brian's smirk faltered. Judge Harris, he said through gritted teeth, I can't control when a piece of equipment fails. And yet, Anita continued, leaning forward, it seems to fail quite frequently when you're involved in similar incidents. Care to explain that? The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Brian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Anita thought he might lose his composure. But instead, he shot her a look of pure venom. By the time the court adjourned that day, Anita knew she was walking a fine line. Brian was dangerous, not just because of his position, but because of the power he wielded within a corrupt system. She also knew he wouldn't back down easily. But Anita wasn't backing down either. She'd spent her life fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to let someone like Brian Cole stop her now. The next morning, as Anita entered the courtroom, she felt a shift in the air. Brian was there again, sitting in the back, his presence like a storm cloud looming over the proceedings. But Anita refused to be intimidated. That's when it happened. As the proceedings began, Brian suddenly stood up, marched to the front of the courtroom, and confronted Anita directly. The entire room watched in shock as he accused her of bias, of being soft on criminals, of being part of the problem. And then he grabbed her arm. Anita stared him down, her voice cutting through the tension in the courtroom like a blade. You have no power here, Officer Cole. None. The room remained frozen, every eye fixed on the confrontation, the air heavy with anticipation. The boldness of her words left the entire courtroom in suspense, the question hanging unspoken in everyone's mind. Would Brian finally face the consequences of his actions, or would the system shield him once again? The moment lingered, thick with uncertainty and tension. The courtroom was frozen in a stunned silence, everyone too shocked to process what had just happened. Anita's unflinching resolve seemed to radiate from her, filling the air with an intensity that was almost tangible. Brian Cole, now visibly flustered, clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles whitening. The bailiff finally stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. Officer Cole, please leave the courtroom. Brian hesitated for a moment, his jaw tightening as he glared at Anita. Then, with a low growl, he stormed out, shoving the heavy doors open with such force that they slammed against the walls. Anita took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of her bench as she regained her composure. She looked over at the jury, some of whom were whispering to one another, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was clear that the spectacle had left an impression. The trial continued, though the air was thick with tension. Witnesses were called, evidence reviewed, and arguments made. Anita maintained her focus, her judicial demeanor unwavering. But beneath it all, her mind was racing. After court adjourned for the day, Anita returned to her chambers, her thoughts still swirling. She knew Brian's behavior was unacceptable, but she also understood the weight of her next steps. If she filed a formal complaint, it would set off a chain reaction. The department's leadership would close ranks around Brian, and Anita would undoubtedly become a target for retaliation. But what choice did she have? This wasn't just about her. It was about the integrity of the court, about the rule of law. Anita had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to stop now. That night, Anita sat in her modest home, her laptop open on the dining table. She was drafting a report of the incident when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, careful who you cross, Your Honor. You don't want to make enemies in the wrong places. Asterisk. Her chest tightened as she stared at the message. It was vague but unmistakably threatening. Anita locked her phone and took a deep breath. She had faced intimidation before, but something about this felt different, more personal. She decided to reach out to a trusted friend, Detective Lisa Monroe. Lisa had been one of the few police officers who understood the importance of rooting out corruption within the force. She had often confided in Anita about the struggles of trying to do the right thing in a system designed to protect its own. When Lisa answered the phone, her voice was warm but tinged with concern. "Anita, what's going on? You don't sound like yourself." Anita explained the events of the past 2 days, including the altercation in court and the threatening text. Lisa listened quietly, her tone growing more serious with each detail. "This isn't just about ego," Lisa said finally. "Brian Cole is dangerous. He's been involved in too many incidents that were swept under the rug. If he's targeting you, it's because he sees you as a threat. I can't let this slide, Lisa," Anita said firmly. "If I don't stand up to him, who will?" "You're right," Lisa said, her voice resolute. "But you need to be careful. Brian isn't just a loose cannon. He has connections. If you're going to go after him, you need to make sure you've got backup." The following day, Anita returned to court with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew Brian would likely retaliate, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. As the trial resumed, Anita noticed Brian standing outside the courtroom, his arms crossed as he spoke with another officer. They both glanced at her as she walked past, their expressions cold and calculating. Inside, the case against Marcus Evans was nearing its climax. The defense had presented a compelling argument, painting a picture of a young man caught in a system stacked against him. The prosecution, however, was relentless, portraying Marcus as a dangerous criminal who needed to be removed from society. Anita listened carefully to both sides, her mind sharp as she weighed the evidence. She knew the jury would ultimately decide Marcus's fate, but her role was to ensure a fair trial, something she took very seriously. As the trial continued, Anita noticed a shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. The tension that had been simmering since Brian's outburst was beginning to boil over. She could see it in the jurors' faces, in the whispered conversations between attorneys, and in the subtle glances exchanged by spectators. By the time court adjourned for the day, Anita felt a storm brewing. She could feel the weight of the trial pressing down on her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. That evening, as Anita drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, where she spotted a dark SUV trailing several car lengths behind her. She turned onto a side street, then another, her heart pounding as the SUV matched her every move. Finally, she pulled into a gas station, parking near the bright lights of the storefront. The SUV slowed as it passed, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. For a moment, it seemed as though the driver might stop, but then the vehicle sped off into the night. Anita sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to calm her breathing. She couldn't prove it, but she was certain the SUV had been following her. The next morning, Anita arrived at the courthouse to find an envelope waiting on her desk. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in bold, black letters. Asterisk, drop the case, or else. Asterisk. Anita stared at the note, her resolve hardening. She knew she was in dangerous territory, but she also knew she couldn't back down. Not now. She placed the note in a drawer, locking it away before turning her attention to the trial. As the proceedings resumed, Anita's focus was razor-sharp. She knew the stakes were higher than ever, and she was determined to see justice served. The day was progressing smoothly until the courtroom doors burst open. Brian Cole stormed in, his face red with anger. The entire room turned to watch as he marched up to Anita's bench, his voice booming. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You're targeting me because of who I am." Anita stood, her voice calm but commanding. "Officer Cole, you are disrupting this court. I suggest you leave immediately." Brian ignored her, his words growing more heated. The bailiff stepped forward, but Brian held up a hand, his tone turning venomous. "You think you can ruin me?" he hissed. "We'll see who comes out on top." The courtroom was silent, the tension almost suffocating. Brian's words hung in the air like a threat, his presence a dark shadow over the proceedings. The courtroom was a pressure cooker ready to explode. Brian's words hung heavy in the air, his hostility almost palpable. Anita stood firm, her calm composure acting as a shield against the storm raging before her. The bailiff stepped closer, ready to intervene, but Anita raised a hand, signaling for him to hold back. "Officer Cole," Anita said, her voice steady and unwavering, This is your final warning. Leave this courtroom, or you will be held in contempt of court." Brian's jaw tightened as his gaze swept across the room, lingering on the jury, the attorneys, and finally back to Anita. His smirk returned, but this time it was laced with malice. He turned abruptly, storming out of the courtroom, slamming the heavy doors behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Anita took a deep breath and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Let us proceed with today's testimony." That night, Anita's exhaustion was evident as she arrived home. Her usually sharp mind was clouded with unease, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on her. She couldn't shake the image of Brian's face, the venom in his tone, the implied threat in his words. She tried to relax, pouring herself a glass of water and sinking into her couch. But her reprieve was short-lived. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with another unknown number. Hesitating, she picked it up and opened the message. Asterisk, you were warned. Back off. Asterisk. The message sent a chill down her spine. Anita had expected resistance, but the escalation was happening faster than she'd anticipated. She immediately called Lisa Monroe, knowing she couldn't face this alone. "Lisa, it's getting worse," Anita said, her voice shaking slightly as she explained the message. Lisa didn't hesitate. "I'm coming over," she said. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone." Anita was grateful for her friend's quick response. Within 30 minutes, Lisa was at her door, her police badge tucked discreetly under her jacket. She carried a sense of authority and assurance that made Anita feel safer, if only slightly. "Let me see the messages," Lisa said, her tone all business as she examined Anita's phone. Her expression darkened as she read them. "This isn't just intimidation. This is a direct threat." Lisa began pacing the room, formulating a plan. "We need to document everything. I'll file an official report, but I'll also start digging into Brian Cole. If he's sending these messages, we'll find a way to prove it." The next morning, Anita was back in court. Her determination hadn't wavered, but her nerves were frayed. She could feel the pressure mounting with every step she took, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. The trial resumed, and the defense called their final witness, Marcus Evans himself. Marcus, a soft-spoken young man with a nervous energy, took the stand. He glanced at Anita as he swore his oath, and she gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Marcus," the defense attorney began, "can you tell the court what happened the night you were arrested?" Marcus hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. "I was walking my sister home from a friend's house," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was late, and we were trying to hurry." "What happened next?" the attorney prompted gently. "We were almost home when a police car pulled up," Marcus continued, his voice growing steadier. "The officer got out and started yelling at us to stop. My sister got scared and started crying, so I tried to explain we were just going home." "Which officer was this?" the attorney asked. Marcus swallowed hard. "Officer Cole." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Anita glanced at the jury, noting the mix of shock and discomfort on their faces. She could see them piecing the story together, their expressions shifting as Marcus's words painted a vivid picture. "What happened after that?" the attorney asked. Marcus's voice trembled again. "He grabbed me and shoved me against the car. My sister was screaming, but he didn't stop. I wasn't fighting him. I just wanted him to let her go. That's when he hit me." "Did you hit him back?" the attorney asked. "No," Marcus said firmly. "I never touched him. I just begged him to stop." The room fell silent as Marcus's testimony sank in. Anita's gaze moved to the prosecution, who were furiously scribbling notes, their carefully constructed case beginning to unravel. As court adjourned for the day, Anita noticed Brian lurking near the entrance. He wasn't making any overt moves, but his presence was enough to send a clear message. Anita walked past him without acknowledging him, her heart pounding as she exited the building. That evening, she received another message on her phone. This time it wasn't a threat. It was a photograph, a blurry image of her home, taken from the street. Anita stared at the screen, her stomach twisting in knots. She immediately called Lisa, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. Lisa's response was swift and firm. I'm sending a patrol car to your house. And I'm coming over again. This is crossing a line. By the time Lisa arrived, Anita was visibly shaken. Lisa wasted no time securing the house, checking locks and windows, and making sure Anita felt as safe as possible. We need to escalate this, Lisa said, her tone leaving no room for argument. If Brian Cole is doing this, we'll make sure he's held accountable. But you need to be prepared for a fight. Anita nodded, her resolve hardening once again. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she wasn't about to back down. Not now. As the night stretched on, the two women discussed their plan of action. Lisa promised to pull strings, gather evidence, and bring in allies who could help expose Brian and his network of corruption. Anita, meanwhile, would focus on the trial, ensuring that Marcus got the justice he deserved. The storm brewing around them was growing stronger, but neither woman was willing to let it break them. Anita woke up the next morning to a knock at her door. It was Detective Lisa Monroe, coffee in hand and a grim look on her face. "We got a problem," Lisa said as she stepped inside. She placed the coffee on the kitchen counter and pulled out her phone. "I did some digging on Brian Cole, and what I found isn't just disturbing, it's dangerous." Lisa handed her phone to Anita, who scrolled through a series of files and photos. They documented multiple incidents involving Brian. Altercations with civilians, questionable arrests, and even accusations of tampering with evidence. Each case was labeled unresolved or dismissed due to lack of evidence. "Look at this," Lisa continued, pointing to one of the files. "This isn't just one bad cop. Brian is connected to a group of officers who've been covering for each other for years. Complaints disappear, body cam footage goes missing, and witnesses suddenly stop cooperating. It's a whole network." Anita's stomach churned as she absorbed the information. "And now he's targeting me because I'm threatening his house of cards." Lisa nodded grimly. "Exactly. He knows if Marcus is acquitted, it's going to raise questions about him. He can't afford that, so he's trying to intimidate you into backing off." Anita's resolve hardened. "Then we need to make sure Marcus gets the justice he deserves. And we need to expose Brian for what he really is." The trial resumed that afternoon, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Anita noticed Brian in the back again, his icy stare fixed on her. She refused to let it rattle her. The prosecution called its final witness, another officer who had been present during Marcus's arrest. Officer Derek Mills was a younger cop, visibly nervous as he took the stand. "Officer Mills," the prosecutor began, "can you confirm that you were with Officer Cole the night Marcus Evans was arrested?" "Yes," Mills said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And can you describe what happened that night?" Mills hesitated, glancing toward Brian, who was sitting in the back of the room with his arms crossed. Anita caught the silent exchange, her instincts telling her that Mills was hiding something. "Well," Mills began, "we stopped Marcus because he matched the description of a suspect we were looking for. When we approached him, he became aggressive." "Did you witness Marcus assault Officer Cole?" Mills hesitated again, his eyes darting to Brian. I didn't see the initial contact, but Officer Cole told me Marcus tried to hit him." The defense attorney stood up, his expression sharp. "Permission to cross-examine, Your Honor?" Anita nodded, her voice firm. "Granted." The defense attorney approached the stand, his tone calm but probing. "Officer Mills, you mentioned that Marcus matched the description of a suspect. Can you specify what that description was?" Mills fumbled with his words. "A young black male in a dark hoodie." "That's it?" the attorney asked. "Yes." The attorney paused for effect, letting the vagueness of the description sink in. "Now, you also said you didn't witness Marcus assault Officer Cole. Is that correct?" "Yes," Mills admitted, his voice quieter now. "So your testimony is based entirely on what Officer Cole told you?" Mills nodded reluctantly. The defense attorney leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "Officer Mills, are you aware of any complaints or investigations involving Officer Cole's conduct?" Mills shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I can't comment on that." The defense attorney pressed on. "Is it because you're afraid of retaliation, Officer Mills?" The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Mills as he squirmed in the witness chair. He glanced again at Brian, whose expression was unreadable but menacing. Finally, Mills looked down, his voice barely audible. Yes. The testimony sent shockwaves through the room. The jury was visibly affected, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Anita maintained her composure, but inside she felt a mix of vindication and dread. Mills's admission was a crack in Brian's armor, but it also painted a target on the young officer's back. As court adjourned, Anita noticed Brian lingering near the doors. He didn't approach her, but his presence was enough to remind her that the fight was far from over. That evening, Lisa called with an update. I talked to some people I trust in the department, she said. They're willing to help, but they're scared. Brian's influence runs deep, and nobody wants to be the one to take him down. What about Mills? Anita asked. He's already testified. He's going to need protection. I'm working on that, Lisa assured her. But we need more than his testimony. We need hard evidence, something that ties Brian directly to his actions. Anita sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. I just hope we can find it before it's too late. The next morning, Anita arrived at the courthouse to find her tires slashed. A sense of unease settled over her as she called for a tow truck, her thoughts racing. It was a clear message. Brian was escalating his intimidation tactics. Lisa met her at the courthouse, her face grim as she examined the damage. This isn't just a scare tactic, she said. He's trying to break you. Anita straightened her shoulders. Then we need to break him first. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thicker than ever. The defense rested its case, and the jury was instructed to deliberate. As they filed out, Anita noticed Brian watching her again, his expression smug. But before the jury could leave the room, chaos erupted. A man burst into the courtroom, shouting at the top of his lungs. He was holding a folder filled with papers, waving it wildly as he yelled. "This trial is a sham," he screamed. "You're all being lied to." The bailiffs rushed to restrain him, but Anita raised a hand. "Let him speak," she said, her voice steady but curious. The man handed the folder to the defense attorney, his hands shaking. "This is everything you need to know about Brian Cole," he said. "It's all in there." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the man was escorted out. The defense attorney opened the folder, his eyes widening as he skimmed the contents. "Your Honor," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "I request a recess to review this evidence." Anita nodded, her heart pounding. She didn't know what was in that folder, but she knew it had the potential to change everything. The courtroom remained a hive of whispers and speculation as the defense attorney clutched the mysterious folder, his expression a mix of astonishment and determination. Anita called a recess, allowing the defense team time to review the new evidence while the prosecution scrambled to figure out what had just happened. Anita retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. Who was that man? What exactly was in the folder? And, most importantly, how much danger had this trial just invited into her life? Lisa called as Anita sat at her desk, staring at the empty wall as if it held the answers. "I heard what happened," Lisa said, her voice low but tense. "You okay?" "For now," Anita replied. "But this folder, if it's what I think it is, we're about to open Pandora's box." The courtroom reconvened an hour later. The defense attorney stood with the folder in hand, his face now a mask of calm professionalism. "Your Honor," he began, "this folder contains documents and photographs that directly implicate Officer Brian Cole in a pattern of misconduct, including falsifying evidence, excessive use of force, and tampering with body camera footage." The prosecutor immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection! This evidence was not submitted during discovery." "Your Honor," the defense countered, "this evidence only came into our possession today. Given its relevance to this trial, we request it be admitted under extraordinary circumstances." Anita considered the arguments carefully. Her judicial training demanded impartiality, but her gut told her this was no ordinary case. "The evidence will be admitted," she said firmly, "but I will allow the prosecution additional time to review and respond." The prosecutor's frustration was evident, but he had no choice but to comply. The folder was handed to the court clerk and copies made for all parties. As the evidence was examined, a clearer picture began to emerge. The documents included internal police reports that had been altered to cover up complaints against Brian. There were transcripts of emails between him and other officers, detailing how they coordinated their stories to protect one another. Most damning of all, there was a series of photographs showing Brian in situations that were difficult to explain, meeting with known criminals, mishandling evidence, and even a blurred shot of him slipping something into what appeared to be a body cam. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the defense laid out their findings. The jury was visibly shaken, their eyes darting between the evidence and Brian, who now sat rigid and pale in the back of the courtroom. The defense attorney turned to Officer Mills, who had been called back to the stand. Officer Mills, you testified earlier that you were afraid of retaliation if you spoke out against Officer Cole. After seeing this evidence, do you have anything else to add? Mills hesitated, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. I didn't know about all of this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't know he was covering things up. He told me what to say after Marcus's arrest. I didn't see Marcus do anything wrong that night. Why didn't you come forward sooner? The attorney pressed. Mills swallowed hard. Because I knew what would happen if I did. People who go against him, they don't last long in this department. The courtroom was electric. Anita's gaze swept the room, noting the expressions on the jury's faces, the quiet fury of the prosecution, and the stunned disbelief of those who had doubted Marcus's innocence. Brian, however, was no longer sitting idly. He suddenly stood up, his face red with anger. "This is all lies," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "These people are out to get me, because I'm the one who keeps this city safe." The bailiffs moved quickly, urging him to leave the room. But Brian didn't back down. Instead, he pointed a finger at Anita. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You don't know who you're messing with." Anita locked eyes with him, her expression calm but resolute. "Officer Cole, you're dangerously close to being held in contempt of court. I suggest you leave before you make things worse for yourself." Brian's glare lingered for a moment longer before he turned and stormed out, slamming the doors behind him. Later that evening, Anita sat in her chambers, reviewing the day's events. The trial had taken an explosive turn, and while progress had been made, she knew the fight was far from over. The evidence against Brian was damning, but Anita also knew how deep corruption could run. Lisa arrived at her office, a folder of her own in hand. "I've been busy," she said, dropping the folder on Anita's desk. "This is everything we have on Brian's connections in the department. It's worse than I thought." Anita opened the folder and began scanning its contents. The documents detailed a web of influence that extended beyond the police force, local politicians, business owners, and even members of the judiciary. It was a system designed to protect itself at all costs. "If we're going to take him down," Lisa said, "we need to go after the whole network. Otherwise, they'll just find someone else to replace him." Anita nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." The next morning, as Anita arrived at the courthouse, she noticed something unusual. A group of protesters had gathered outside, holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Corruption." The sight filled Anita with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The trial was no longer just about Marcus. It had become a flashpoint for a larger movement. Inside, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. The defense prepared to call their final witness, a forensic expert who had analyzed the newly uncovered evidence. But before the proceedings could begin, a loud crash echoed through the halls. The courtroom doors burst open, and a figure staggered inside, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. It was the man who had delivered the folder the day before. "They know," he gasped, clutching his side. "They're coming for you next." He collapsed to the floor, sending the courtroom into chaos. The courtroom erupted in a chaos as the man crumpled to the floor, his breathing shallow and labored. Bailiffs rushed to his side, calling for paramedics, while Anita quickly rose from her seat, her heart pounding. The man's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "They're coming for you next." Asterisk. Lisa, who had been seated in the gallery, was already moving toward the man. "Don't move him," she ordered the bailiffs, kneeling to check his pulse. "He's in shock, but he's alive. We need an ambulance now." Anita gestured to the court clerk to adjourn the proceedings temporarily, then made her way down from the bench. Her voice was calm but firm as she addressed the gallery. "Everyone, Please remain seated until the paramedics arrive. We'll resume once the situation is under control. The man stirred slightly, his lips moving as if trying to speak. Lisa leaned closer, her ear near his mouth. "Who?" she asked softly. "Who did this to you?" He struggled to form the words. "It's Brian. He knows about the folder." The paramedics arrived moments later, wheeling the man out as whispers rippled through the room. Anita returned to her chambers, Lisa following close behind. The tension between them was palpable. "This is escalating fast," Lisa said, shutting the door behind her. "Brian's not just trying to intimidate anymore. He's actively silencing people." Anita sank into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. "If that's true, we need to act before someone else gets hurt. What's our next move?" Lisa's face hardened. "We take what we have to someone higher up, someone outside the local system. This goes beyond Brian. It's systemic. We need federal oversight." Anita nodded slowly. "The Department of Justice." Lisa glanced at her watch. "I can make a few calls, but it'll take time. In the meantime, you need to be extra careful. No more driving alone, no late nights at the courthouse, and absolutely no unplanned meetings." Anita let out a dry laugh. "You make it sound like I'm in witness protection." "You might as well be," Lisa said seriously. "Brian's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." The trial resumed later that afternoon, but the atmosphere was tense. The jury had seen too much, both in the evidence and in the dramatic interruptions. Anita could see the weight of it all in their eyes. The defense called their forensic expert, Dr. Clara Bowen, to the stand. Dr. Bowen was a soft-spoken but confident woman in her early 40s, with years of experience in digital forensics. "Dr. Bowen," the defense attorney began, "can you explain your findings regarding the evidence presented in the folder?" Dr. Bowen adjusted her glasses, her voice steady as she spoke. "The documents and images in the folder were thoroughly analyzed for authenticity. I can confirm that the metadata matches the dates and locations tied to Officer Cole's previous incidents. These are not fabricated. They're real." The defense attorney nodded. "And what about the emails included in the folder? Were you able to trace their origins?" "Yes," Dr. Bowen replied. "The emails were sent from accounts tied to Officer Cole and other individuals within his department. Their IP addresses and server logs verify their authenticity." The jury was captivated. Even the prosecution seemed rattled, their confidence visibly shaken as Dr. Bowen laid out her findings. As the trial adjourned for the day, Anita left the courthouse under heavy escort, her nerves frayed. The protests outside had grown larger, the chants for justice echoing through the streets. The sight was both inspiring and unnerving. Lisa met her at the courthouse steps, her expression grim. "I've got news," she said, motioning for Anita to follow her to the car. "I reached out to a contact in the DOJ. They're interested, but they need more. They want you to delay the verdict until they can gather their own evidence." Anita frowned. "Delay the verdict? How am I supposed to justify that without compromising the trial?" "You're the judge," Lisa said bluntly. "If anyone can find a way, it's you. But we need time. If this verdict goes out before the DOJ can step in, Brian's people might bury everything." That evening, Anita returned home, her exhaustion mounting. She double-checked every lock on her doors and windows before settling onto the couch with her laptop. Her inbox was flooded with emails, some supportive, others threatening. One in particular caught her attention. The subject line read, "*last warning*." Anita hesitated before opening it. The email contained a single sentence. "*drop the trial or lose everything." Attached was a photo of her standing in her driveway, taken earlier that morning. Her chest tightened as she stared at the image. They were watching her, even in her most private moments. She immediately called Lisa, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. "I'll send a patrol car to sit outside your house," Lisa said. "But Anita, this is getting out of hand. You need to consider stepping back, just until this blows over." Anita's grip on the phone tightened. "If I back down now, they win. I've spent my entire career fighting for justice, Lisa. I'm not stopping now." Lisa sighed. "Then we need to hit back harder. I'll see what else I can dig up on Brian and his network." but promise me you'll stay safe." The next morning, Anita arrived at the courthouse to find a letter taped to her office door. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear. Asterisk, "You've gone too far. We'll make sure you regret it." Asterisk. She removed the letter and handed it to Lisa, who was waiting in her chambers. "They're escalating," Anita said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. Lisa scanned the letter, her expression darkening. "This is a direct threat. We need to bring in federal protection. No more waiting." Anita nodded reluctantly. "Do it, and let's make sure the jury is safe too. If they feel threatened, this trial could fall apart." The day's proceedings began with an air of quiet determination. The jury listened intently as closing arguments were made. The defense's case was compelling, bolstered by the damning evidence against Brian Cole. The prosecution, meanwhile, struggled to recover, their arguments sounding hollow in the face of overwhelming proof. As the jury was dismissed to begin deliberations, Anita felt a strange calm settle over her. She knew the next 24 hours would be critical, both for the trial and for her own safety. Just as she was preparing to leave the courtroom, Lisa burst in, her face pale. "They've found something," Lisa said, her voice urgent. "Brian's people are planning something big. We need to act now." Anita's heart sank as Lisa's words hung in the air, the gravity of the situation becoming all too real. Anita stared at Lisa, her mind racing. "What do you mean, something big? What are they planning?" Lisa placed a folder on Anita's desk, her expression grim. "It's not just Brian anymore. His network is mobilizing. They're planning to sabotage the trial entirely, intimidate jurors, manipulate evidence, maybe even something worse." Anita flipped through the folder, her stomach churning as she read the details. "How do you know this?" Lisa leaned in, lowering her voice. "One of my contacts, someone on the inside, tipped me off. They overheard a conversation between Brian and his people. They're desperate, Anita. If this trial ends with a conviction, it could blow their whole operation wide open." Anita closed the folder and took a deep breath. "What do we do? How do we protect everyone?" Lisa didn't hesitate. "I've already contacted the DOJ again. They're sending agents to secure the courthouse and keep an eye on the jury. But you need to delay the verdict for as long as you can. The more time we have, the better our chances of dismantling this network." The next morning, Anita arrived at the courthouse under heavy police escort. The tension in the air was palpable. Protesters lined the streets, their chants growing louder as the trial reached its climax. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras capturing every movement. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. The jury had been sequestered overnight, their safety a top priority. Anita took her seat, her face calm, but her mind on high alert. The jury returned after hours of deliberation, their faces serious as they filed into the room. The foreperson handed a sealed envelope to the clerk, who passed it to Anita. She held it in her hands for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But before she could open it, the courtroom doors burst open, and a man stormed in, his face covered with a bandana. In his hand was a small device that looked like a phone, but emitted a steady, ominous beep. "Everybody stay where you are," he shouted, his voice shaking but filled with determination. "No one moves, or I'll blow this place to hell." The room erupted into chaos. Lawyers ducked behind tables, spectators screamed, and the jury huddled together in their box. Anita stood frozen, her mind racing as she processed the situation. Lisa, who had been seated in the gallery, immediately sprang into action. She stepped forward cautiously, her hands raised. "Put the device down," she said calmly. "You don't want to do this." The man's eyes darted between Lisa and Anita, his hand trembling as he held up the device. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "They told me to do this. They said if I didn't, they'd kill my family." Anita's heart sank. This wasn't just an act of desperation. It was a calculated move by Brian and his network to send a message. "Who told you?" Lisa pressed, her voice firm but compassionate. "Who's behind this?" The man hesitated, his resolve crumbling. It's Brian Cole," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "He said this would stop the trial. that it would protect the department. Lisa took a step closer. "We can help you," she said softly. "But you need to put the device down. Nobody needs to get hurt." The man's grip loosened, his shoulders slumping as he lowered the device. The bailiffs moved quickly, restraining him and securing the device, which turned out to be a fake. The tension in the room eased slightly, but Anita knew the fight was far from over. The courtroom was cleared, and the jury was escorted to a secure location. Anita retreated to her chambers, Lisa joining her moments later. "This is bigger than we thought," Anita said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "They're willing to do anything to protect themselves." Lisa nodded. "But we've got something now. That man's testimony could blow the whole thing wide open. If we can get him to talk, it'll give the DOJ what they need to act." Anita leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "How do we keep this trial from collapsing while we do that?" Lisa thought for a moment. "We need to keep the jury safe and focused. I'll work on getting a formal statement from the man we just detained. In the meantime, you hold this courtroom together. No delays, no distractions. Just focus on the facts." The next day, the trial resumed under heightened security. Anita addressed the courtroom with a calm but firm demeanor. "Yesterday's events were a blatant attempt to undermine the integrity of this court. Let me be clear, justice will not be derailed. We will proceed as planned." The jury, visibly shaken but resolute, returned to their seats. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as the proceedings continued. The defense attorney called their final witness, the man who had stormed the courtroom the day before. Now under federal protection, he was prepared to testify against Brian and his network. "Can you tell the court why you entered this courtroom yesterday with what appeared to be an explosive device?" the defense attorney asked. The man, his hands shaking slightly, took a deep breath. "Because Brian Cole told me to. He said if I didn't, he'd hurt my family. He's been threatening me for years." The courtroom gasped as the man recounted his experiences with Brian. How he'd been coerced into participating in cover-ups, how he'd seen evidence tampered with, and how Brian had used fear to control everyone around him. Anita watched the jury closely, noting their reactions. The testimony was raw and powerful, leaving no doubt about the depth of Brian's corruption. As the court adjourned for the day, Anita felt a flicker of hope. The tide was turning, but she knew it wasn't over yet. The stakes were higher than ever, and the final showdown was just around the corner. The final day of the trial dawned under an overcast sky, as though the city itself sensed the gravity of the events about to unfold. The courthouse was surrounded by an increased police presence, federal agents discreetly stationed at key points. Protesters lined the streets, their chants for justice blending into a low, constant roar. Anita arrived early, her mind sharp despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. She reviewed her notes one last time, preparing herself for what she knew would be the most critical day of her career. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged. The jury took their seats, their faces somber but focused. The defense attorney rose, his expression determined, and called their final witness, Detective Lisa Monroe. Lisa, calm and composed, stepped up to the stand and swore the oath. The defense wasted no time. "Detective Monroe," the attorney began, "you've been investigating Officer Brian Cole and his associates. Can you tell the court what you've discovered?" Lisa nodded. "Over the past few weeks, I've gathered evidence of a network within the police department designed to protect certain officers from accountability. This network has engaged in falsifying reports, tampering with evidence, and intimidating witnesses." The defense attorney held up a document. "Is this one of the reports you uncovered?" "Yes," Lisa confirmed. "It's a falsified report from one of Brian Cole's cases. The original report, which I located in an archive database, tells a completely different story, one that implicates Cole in excessive use of force." The attorney approached the jury, handing them copies of the report. "Detective Monroe, why wasn't this original report used in court?" Lisa's jaw tightened. "Because it was buried. It took me weeks to find it, and even then, I only located it because of an anonymous tip." The prosecution tried to object, but Anita overruled them, allowing Lisa to continue. Her testimony painted a damning picture of a department that had enabled Brian's behavior for years. The prosecution called their own witness, the police chief, a stoic man who had been conspicuously silent throughout the trial. His demeanor suggested a man walking a tightrope, trying to protect himself without implicating others. Chief Reynolds, the prosecutor began, can you speak to Officer Cole's record within the department? Reynolds hesitated. Officer Cole has been a decorated officer for over a decade. He's received multiple commendations for his work. In complaints, the prosecutor pressed. Has he ever received complaints about his conduct? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. There have been complaints, yes. The defense attorney immediately stood for cross-examination. Chief Reynolds, how many of those complaints resulted in disciplinary action? Reynolds hesitated again. None. The defense pressed further. Why not? Reynolds' face reddened. We investigated each complaint thoroughly, but there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. Or was it because of the network Detective Monroe described? The defense fired back. A network designed to protect officers like Brian Cole? Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, his silence louder than any answer he could give. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as the closing arguments began. The prosecution tried to salvage their case, painting Marcus Evans as a man who had made poor choices and deserved to face the consequences. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence and testimony that had come to light. The defense's closing argument was a masterstroke. They highlighted the systemic corruption, the intimidation tactics, and the undeniable evidence of Marcus's innocence. The jury listened intently, their expressions unreadable but focused. As the jury retired to deliberate, Anita felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She knew the decision could take hours or even days, but she also knew the evidence was overwhelming. Hours later, the jury returned, their expressions somber but resolute. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in her hands. Anita's heart raced as she addressed the court. Have you reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The foreperson handed the verdict to the clerk, who passed it to Anita. She unfolded the paper, her face neutral as she read its contents. In the case of the state versus Marcus Evans, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Marcus collapsed into tears, his family rushing to embrace him. Spectators cheered, while others sat in stunned silence. Anita allowed the noise to swell for a moment before raising her gavel. Order in the court, she said firmly, her voice cutting through the commotion. The room quieted, and Anita continued. This verdict is a reflection of justice and justice alone. Let it serve as a reminder that no one is above the law. The aftermath was swift and intense. The Department of Justice launched a formal investigation into Brian Cole and his network. Arrests were made, careers ended, and a deep-rooted system of corruption began to unravel. Anita, though relieved by the outcome, knew the fight was far from over. She returned to her chambers, exhausted but resolute. Lisa joined her moments later, a small smile on her face. We did it, Lisa said softly. Anita nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For Marcus, for everyone like him, Lisa placed a hand on Anita's shoulder. And for you, you stood your ground, Anita. You made this happen. Anita sat back in her chair, the weight of the trial finally lifting. Justice had been served, but the journey to get there had come at a cost. She knew there would be more battles ahead, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Outside the courthouse, the chants of the crowd echoed into the evening air. Asterisk justice for Marcus. Justice for all, asterisk.